Oh, look at this kitty here. He's so tired. He's so exhausted. And that's what we're going to talk about is exhaustion gaps when they start to run out of steam. So what is an exhaustion gap? Well, it's all part of these uncommon gaps that we've been talking about, but the exhaustion gaps occur at the end of a trend. And really what they're signaling is things are going to start changing or the party's over. It's starting to end. We're getting exhausted. So what's being exhausted is the news or whatever's happened to propel the energy of the early buyers that drove the security up in the first place. Let's say if it's a upward exhaustion gap, right? So you might have had a breakout gap that changed it and made it go up, let's say as a breakout. You might have had a runaway gap that continued that trend, keeping it going forward. But at some point it runs out of steam and has maybe another gap in prices where you see what's called an exhaustion gap. You know, it's kind of like that one last buyer after a buying frenzy is over. There's like one last person and then it starts to kind of go the other way. That's what an exhaustion gap is. So let's look at an exhaustion gap in relation to what we've been looking at in the other types of gaps. So if we continue with this chart pattern here, you see we talked about our breakaway gap and we talked about our runaway gap, and that created the breakaway gap created the trend, and the runaway gap continued that trend, but then the trend started to run out of steam, and we have an exhaustion gap here. We have that kind of last buyer or buyers jumping up, creating a new gap, saying, this is so exciting, you know, the trend's great, let's drive these prices even higher. And you see where, you know, they start to kind of run out of steam there, and you start having what would become an exhaustion gap, where you have that gap, and then like day 16, you know, we're going to start having overlap, and we're going to start seeing that coming back down, is what would happen in an exhaustion gap. One way you can tell with that too, you know, what's the difference? How do we know it's an exhaustion gap versus a runaway gap, or how to be aware of that? Because maybe that exhaustion gap is just another runaway gap. What we're going to look at is you're going to have low volume on an exhaustion gap, and you're going to have high trading volume on a runaway gap. So you think about, you know, your volume, how many people are actually trading things. If we look at the bottom of this here, you can see on day 12 where we had that real high spike in volume. That means a lot of people wanted to get in on the security on day 12 there, and they drove that price up, and then it kind of continues from there. Where if you see a gap like this exhaustion, what's going to become an exhaustion gap, you're going to see where the volume starts, you have your gap, but then you see that the volume is actually pretty low. Again, that's an indicator that there's, in this example, less buyers out there. There's a couple, maybe the last one, who's willing to pay these premium prices, but it's starting to really run out of steam. It's becoming exhausted. So that means the party's over, so to speak, right? And so you're now going to have some overlap. You're now going to have maybe the security start trading sideways, or maybe even start to, you know, reverse and start going on a downtrend. So when you're trying to decide, am I looking at potentially a runaway gap or an exhaustion gap, look at that volume there and what's been going, you know, typically with the volume on that particular security, you know, leading up to this. And if you see a spike in volume, then it's a gap. In this case, could be a breakaway, or excuse me, a runaway gap. Or in any security, you'd have a high volume with a breakaway gap you'd look for. But an exhaustion gap can be real telling when there's already been an very established trend, and the trend is ending, and that's because you're seeing some low volume there. So be watching that volume there when you're trying to decide, am I seeing a runaway gap or exhaustion gap? And being ready to make a change, you know, either way, whether, you know, looking at where that trend is going to then change ahead and get out if it's appropriate, if it's an exhaustion gap.